Chapter 4 is our introduction to forces and Newton's laws of motion. We're going to solve a whole bunch of quantitative problems with these concepts in Chapter 5, but in Chapter 4, we're just wrapping our minds around the ideas of force and Newton's laws of motion. And we're going to start with some problems that look very straightforward. For instance, this one, a skier is sliding down a 15-degree slope, friction is not negligible, identify the forces on the skier. Looks like a very straightforward problem, but in fact, it's this piece of the puzzle, preparing to solve a problem, identifying the forces that trips people up. So we're going to give you some practice with just the preparation steps in Chapter 4. And then when you get to Chapter 5, this background will serve you well. We want you to get good at the preparation. We want you to practice it. We want you to take it seriously. And when you get to Chapter 5, that preparation, that warm-up will serve you well. So let's go ahead and do this. Let's take a look at this problem. A skier is sliding down a 15-degree slope. Friction is not negligible. Identify the forces on the skier. So what I'm going to do is draw a simple picture of the physical situation. And then what I'm going to do, in this case literally, but at least mentally, is this. Draw a circle around the skier. Because when we're dealing with forces and Newton's laws of motion, we consider one object, in this case the skier, in isolation from everything else. We're interested in what happens to the skier. And I draw a line around it to kind of like separate it from the rest of the world. And then I ask myself, what touches the skier? Well, there's only one place where the skier is touching another object, and that's at the surface, at the slope. And there's a couple of different kinds of forces that can happen at surfaces. There's a normal force. A normal force is point perpendicular to the slope. Okay, so that's one force we can have. There's also a friction force. And we're told in this case that the friction force is not negligible. Well, there's a friction force at this surface, and it's going to point up the slope. And it's kinetic friction because the skier is sliding. And so there's going to be a friction force. That's a second force. And those are the only two contact forces that are affecting the skier because there's nothing else touching the skier. We aren't told anything about air resistance. And if you aren't told to include air resistance, we assume that you can ignore it. Okay? So this is it. Those are our two contact forces. The only other thing we have to consider is long-range forces. And at this point in your physics career, there's one force you need to consider. That's the weight force. And the weight force acts straight down towards the center of the Earth. So we got the normal force, we have the friction force, and we have the weight force. Those are the only three forces that are at work here. Now let's assess this and see if it makes sense. First off, contact forces. There's only one thing that touches the skier, and that's the surface. Surfaces only exert two types of forces, normal force and friction force. We have both of those, so it's good. Then for our assessment, we always have the long-range force here, the weight force. That's going to apply basically in every problem that you see. And so we've accounted for all the forces. And in fact, this makes sense. The normal force keeps the person from falling into the slope. The friction force keeps them from speeding up indefinitely, and the weight force is the thing that pulls them down the slope. Physically, this makes sense and matches our expectation of the way the world works.